So today's topic is elbow joint. Elbow joint is one of the stable joint in our body. So competency related to elbow joint, at the end of this session, the student should able to identify and describe the type of elbow joint, articular surfaces, its capsule and ligaments, the relations of elbow joint, movements, blood supply and nerve supply of elbow joint. So the elbow joint is a synovial joint, belongs to hinge variety. Like a hinge in our door, this elbow joint, it acts like a hinge. It is also a compound joint because the articular surfaces in a compound joint will be more than 2. Here, the articular surfaces are distal end of the humerus, proximal end of ulna and the head of the radius. So, 3 articular surfaces are present in the elbow joint. So, it belongs to compound joint. It is also a uniaxial joint because its movement acts along one axis. Uni means one. So, it acts along one axis. So, what axis? The transverse axis. Next, it is also a complex variety because the joint cavity of the elbow joint communicates with superior radio-ulnar joint. So, it is a complex variety. So, the next we go to the articular surfaces of elbow joint. So, the articular surfaces of elbow joint are distal end of the humerus, proximal end of ulna and the head of the radius as already discussed. Now, we will go to the distal end of the radius, that is the humero-ulnar articulation and humero-radial articulation. So, in humero-ulnar articulation, the trochleas of the humerus articulates with trochlear notch of the ulna. Next is humero-radial articulation. So, in humero-radial articulation, the capitulum which is lying lateral to trochlea articulates with superior surface of head of the radius. So, these are the articular surfaces of elbow joint. So, these articular surfaces, they are not completely congruent with the humeral, that is the trochlear notch of the ulna and the head of the radius, they are not completely congruent with the humeral articular surfaces. The plane of the joint. The plane of the joint lies 2 cm below the line connecting the 2 epicondyle of the humerus. So, this is the interepicondylar line. So, what is cubital articulation? Why this elbow is called cubital articulation? Since the elbow joint cavity and the superior radio-ulnar joint cavity are continuous, it is called as cubital articulation. I will show it in the bone, the articular surfaces. So, first we will go to the distal end of the humerus. So, how the distal end of the humerus? The humerus is irregular in the lower end and it has a pulley-like structure in the middle portion of the distal end of the humerus, which is called trochlea. Okay, and then just lateral to trochlea, there is a round structure called capitulum. And there are 2 projections on either side of the distal end of the humerus, medial epicondyle and lateral epicondyle. And there are 2 depressions just above, one above the trochlea called as coronoid fossa and another one above the capitulum called as radial fossa. So, I will show it in the bone now. This is the distal end of the humerus. In the this is the anterior aspect. You can see the trochlea, which is a pulley-like structure present in the medial aspect. a round structure which is lying lateral to trochlea is the capitulum, and there are two projections on either side. This is medial epicondyle, this is lateral epicondyle. A fossa just above the trochlea is the coronoid fossa. This is coronoid fossa. And another small fossa above the capitulum is the radial fossa. Coming to the posterior view, in the posterior view, comparatively big fossa present. This is olecranon fossa. So, in the posterior aspect, this is the medial epicondyle and this is lateral epicondyle. The medial epicondyle, closer to medial epicondyle, there is a sulcus. So, this sulcus is the sulcus for ulnar nerve, and the lateral epicondyle is smooth and subcutaneous. This is smooth and subcutaneous. Coming to inferior view. This is the inferior view. In the inferior view, you can see the trochlea and the capitulum. So, the trochlea is occupying the anterior aspect, inferior aspect as well as the posterior aspect, whereas capitulum is present anteriorly as well as inferiorly. Going to the next distal articular surface, that is on the medial aspect, is proximal end of ulna. This is the proximal end of the ulna and this is the distal end of the ulna. So, this is the proximal part of the ulna. You can see a projection, superior projection. This is the olecranon process, and then anterior projection. This is coronoid process. Coronoid process, olecranon process. So, this is proximal end of the ulna. There are two projections. This is olecranon process. One projection in the anterior aspect. This is coronoid process. And this surface is the trochlear notch. Here you can appreciate one ridge. This ridge is the this part of the ridge does not take part in the articulation. So, this is a non-articular area of the ulna. And then this is the coronoid process. This is the margin of the coronoid process, and laterally you can see one depression. So, this depression is the radial notch of the ulna where the head of the radius articulates. Next is proximal end of the radius. So, in the proximal end of the radius, the head of the radius only take part in the elbow joint.